All right, well, I think we're going to go ahead and start. I know a few people are still en route from coffee or from their homes, but we will get going anyway. So for those of you who don't know me, who are wondering who is that good-looking guy standing up front, let me introduce myself. My name is Brian Gamel, and I work at Baylor at Truett Seminary. I get my PhD in New Testament. And today and I've been asked to help teach this class. And so you will get me today and next week, and I think another week in here somewhere. So if this becomes unbearable, then just know that there is going to be a break in this at some point. But they have asked me to do these parts of talking about Revelation. And so today we are covering Revelation 2 and 3, which is the letters to the 7 churches. But before we get into looking at this text, and I do want to spend some time looking at Revelation 2 and 3, I want to just do a short little recap. I know we've been talking a lot of big picture things about Revelation, and I think that having a 30,000-foot view of what we're attempting to do will help us get a sense of how to read this part of Revelation, because it's going to be a little straightforward this week, and then it gets weird next week. It's very trippy, and I think having a background will help us make sense of that. Okay, so the book of Revelation suffers from two distinct but opposite kind of tendencies in the history of interpretation. So when Christians have looked at this book and tried to make sense of it, there are two different ways, generally, two kind of categories that people have tended to read the book of Revelation. The first way of reading Revelation has been to be obsessed with seeing Revelation as a kind of puzzle to decode. And on one level, you can't blame people for this kind of tendency, because there's a lot of things in the book of Revelation that seem to invite this kind of way of making sense of it. We've already talked a little bit about the language that John uses, the author, where he says these are the things that must soon take place. And then you have all these weird visions and this imagery and this symbolism. And not last week, but 2 weeks ago when Aaron was introducing us for the first chapter, then we saw a lot of this imagery, that was very bewildering to us. So there's a long history of this. If this image looks familiar, it probably won't. It is because it was about a prediction for the end of the world that was going to happen in the mid-1800s. There's a guy named William Miller, and he started reading Revelation and other parts of the Bible, and he thought, after his careful reading, that he had designed, or he had predicted precisely when the world was going to end. And spoiler alert, it didn't end. Right? We're all still here. He was wrong, but he predicted it based on his careful reading of Revelation. And people actually quit their job, and they went to go wait for Jesus on a hill. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited in the sunset, and they were still waiting. So nothing happened. It was called the Great Disappointment. And then what he did later, and that's kind of a slightly underwhelming response, especially if you've quit your job, if you had that moment where you're like, I'm done, and you walked out, and then you realize, crap, I got to go back and get my job back, right? That's going to be hard. Or if you sold all your stuff. So he recalculated, and he's like, actually, it's not in May, it's going to be in October. And then he was wrong about that as well. But he predicted that was going to be the end of the world. And of course, he was wrong about that. But this kind of thing kept happening all throughout Christian history. In fact, it gave rise to, if you see here, this is a chart. You can't read this very well. The resolution's not great. But this is kind of a chart that was inspired by Miller's reading about the plan of history. And you can see here there's a whole plan of history from the beginning of time until the end of time, and everything that happens in between. It was all meant to show us that all of history is contained in this kind of grand plan. And if you can read Revelation the right way, then you can figure out where you are in history. But everybody who reads Revelation this way always tends to think that the things that it's talking about are happening in their time. Clearly, the things that are happening right now are the things that Revelation is talking about. So William Miller was a great example of this. Jehovah's Witnesses, they're their denomination started because they were reading Revelation, and in it says that there's 144,000 who are going to be saved. And we'll get to this. This is a later part of Revelation, except that here's the Velociraptor who's asking questions like, if the Jehovah's Witnesses really think that there's only 144,000 who get saved, why are they telling everybody? There's only so many spots, and after that it's all filled up. Well, their church begins this way. This is a big message that they talk about, like it's decoding. We figured it out. There's only so many of us who have the right reading, the right understanding, and then they hit 144,000, and guess what happens? Well, that's a symbolic number now. Like it's now it doesn't mean actually 144,000 because we've hit that unit. It's all come up, and of course there's much more popular understandings of Revelation as well. Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet Earth in the 70s was a way of talking about decoding Revelation and the end of the world. And of course, then there's also the two movies Left Behind. One of the Kirk Cameron, everyone's got to love him, the classic, and then of course the Nicolas Cage. And in these two, how can you choose between Cameron and Cage? I'm not really sure which one of these is better. But all of this is inspired by a reading of Revelation which says Revelation is here to be decoded. It's a way of taking the text apart and trying to figure out how this makes sense of our history in our time. And again, everybody who's done this has always done it in a way that sees their own time as the time that Revelation is talking about. So that's the first way of reading Revelation in Christian history. It's been this kind of obsession with decoding. But there's been another kind of distinct but opposite reaction to reading Revelation, and that is simply to neglect the book entirely and dismiss it. And so our own beloved Martin Luther, this is what he has to say about Martin Luther, the blessed founder of the Reformation, did not like the book of Revelation. And these are some of the things he writes about it in his introduction to the New Testament. He introduces each book before he translates it into German and makes a commentary on it. And this is what he says about it. About this book of the Revelation of John, I leave everyone free to hold his own opinions. I would not have anyone bound to my opinion or judgment. I say what I feel. This is what Martin Luther always does. I miss more than one thing in this book, and it makes me consider it to be neither apostolic nor prophetic. First and foremost, the apostles do not deal with visions but prophecy in clear and plain words. For it befits the apostolic office to speak clearly of Christ and his deeds without images and visions. Moreover, he, meaning John, seems to give to me to be going much too far when he commends his own book so highly, indeed more than any of the other sacred books do, though they are much more important, and threatens that if anyone takes away anything from it, God will take away from him, etc. Again, they are supposed to be blessed who keep what is written in this book, and yet no one knows what that is, to say nothing of keeping it. This is the same as if we did not have the book at all. So later, in another writing, Martin Luther says of Revelation that a revelation ought to be revealing, and it is not, in his opinion. And so what Martin Luther does, he always tells us exactly what he thinks. This is a great thing this is both a blessing and a curse with Luther, is he's very clear on what he thinks about things, and he's not afraid to say and be very candid about it. He writes a list of all the New Testament books, and he numbers 23 of them. And you can tell these are the 23 he really cares about, and then 4 of them he puts at the end, and he doesn't number them. And Revelation's one of them that he doesn't quite get as excited about. Yes, question? Great question, right? And so one of the reasons why it's so different is because it's the only kind of book of its type that we have basically in the Bible. We talked about this, Rachel talked about this when we first started, about the genre of it, and we're going to go over genre again as a refresher, because it's the only book that is apocalyptic. And so because of that, it seems bewildering. It would be like if we were reading a manual for like how to do your car. You're going through it and like, this is my Honda, this is how drive works, this is how the moonroof works, and all of a sudden then you had a poem in there. And you're like, well, what does this tell me about how to drive my car, right? I mean, this is about fields and flowers and butterflies, but where's the transmission section? So if you came across a poem in the middle of a book about how to drive your car, you would be bewildered because you probably wouldn't know what to do with it. I wouldn't know what to do with it. I just figured out prose poetry like a year or two ago, and I'm very proud of myself for that. So I know some of you here are like English scholars, and I'm Johnny come lately to that, but I like got it, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. But it's because Revelation is the only book of its type in the Bible. That's why it seems so different. We're going to talk about that. I think that's going to help us make sense of what we're going to read. So Luther doesn't like Revelation, and part of the reason Luther doesn't like Revelation is because during his own time, there were people who were using Revelation to endorse a kind of revolt against society, and that probably did not endear him to it. They were using Revelation as a pretext to say, let's flatten all structures, let's overcome everything. And so Luther, that was not what he was about. So he doesn't like it. So you have these two tendencies, to be obsessed with Revelation and want to decode it and to figure out what's the puzzle, how can I, like which political leaders and what geopolitical things happening now are the things that we should be obsessed with, or this is a whole mess, let's just forget about it, and I wish it wasn't there. And so really, if you look at the streams, the major streams of Christianity, those streams that are more evangelical or Pentecostal, more energetic, they tend to love Revelation, they pick up on it. And those that are more mainline, more intellectual, more established, they tend to dismiss it. Both those, I think, are a mistake. So I do want to talk about a guide for our understanding of Revelation. So we're getting in now to the weeds of it this week and the next. And I want to talk about three things that I think can help us to make sense of Revelation. One is to understand that Revelation actually has three genres in it. So we've talked about apocalypse before, and I'm not going to go over this in great detail because Rachel did such a great job a couple weeks ago, whatever it was. So Revelation is apocalyptic. It is unveiling. It's a way of seeing the world in a writing that is very different than the Gospels or Paul's letters or even the prophecies of the Old Testament or history. It participates in a different genre. But in addition to that, it is also a letter. And of course, that's going to be relevant for us when we turn in just a few minutes to look at the letters in Revelation. And in addition to that, it is also a prophecy. And this is the thing that we saw a couple weeks ago when we were reading the first chapter. This is a prophecy that John says, this is the prophecy I'm putting before you. Because of that, it's all three of those things at once. It is apocalyptic, it is a letter, and it is a prophecy, and that applies to all of it. It's not just, we're going to read the letters today, but we have to remember that all the rest of Revelation is also a letter to these individual churches. It's sent to these places. Another thing to understand is that Revelation is a critique of Roman power. It is written in a time that, in a particular time and place, and in this time and place, we are dealing with Rome. And we'll look at Rome again in a second. But it is, if nothing else, a critique of the way in which power is understood and used by the Romans. And so over and over again, when we come back to it, when we're talking about the beast and the dragon and crazy things in Revelation, we can understand it as a way of critiquing Roman power. And the third way of understanding Revelation, the third guide, I think, to helping us understand it, is that it is a kind of anti-accommodationist literature. And what we mean by that is that one of the things that Revelation is trying to do is to pull us outside of ourselves, to pull us outside of our own context so that we can understand the way in which we're living from a different perspective. It's anti-accommodationist. In other words, it's a call to not accommodate yourself to the way that things are, to not see the world the same way that everyone else sees the world. Don't accommodate yourself to the way that things are. Okay, so just as a reminder, this is our map of the Roman Empire as we get into it. So this is all of Rome and its height and its glory, right? It's essentially an empire focused on the Mediterranean. You can see that basically it's all around the Mediterranean Sea. And this is because transportation was really easy by boat and really hard by everything else. And so the Romans are able to have this vast empire that lasts for so long because they have this great sea in the middle of it. We are looking at this area in particular, right? So this is the area we're focused on. This is modern-day Turkey, but it was called Asia. The Romans didn't know there was a whole continent called Asia, and so they called this Asia, right? Which is technically Asia, I think. Geographers here, you can help me out. This is, I think, technically Asia, but that's what they called Asia, right? For us, Asia is like a whole giant continent. Asia for them was this little bit, and Africa was this little bit, and that's all they knew, right? Obviously, their view of the world was very limited compared to ours. And these are the 7 churches that John is writing to. So these are the areas, like these specific places John's writing to. And, of course, there he is again on his island of Patmos, right? That's where he's writing from. Okay, so I want us to read. So if you have a Bible or an app or something, I want us to be able to turn to Revelation 2. And we're not going to read all of these because it's a lot to go through all this. But I want us to read a little bit of it. And can I get a volunteer to read Revelation, starting in chapter 2, the first 7 verses? First 7 verses. Anyone willing to read for us? Anna, thank you.
To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your works, your toil and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear with those who are evil, but have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and found them to be false. I know you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen. Repent and do the works you did at first. If not, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent. Yet this you have, you hate the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, now I would like a volunteer to read the next section, which is verses 8 through 11. Can I get someone to read that? Yes.
And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich. I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Beware, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, so that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have affliction. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death.
Okay, some observations. What do you notice about these? We could read all 7, and we're not going to do that because we don't have time to read through all 7 of them in detail. But just these 2, what are some observations you've noticed about these letters to the churches?
He's critiquing the churches.
Okay, yeah, say more about that.
I'm sorry.
Say more about that. He's critiquing the churches. How so?
Well, he points out their abuse or their weakness, I guess I should say.
Okay, yes.
And says that they better get it in order.
Okay, yes, good.
Just
Okay,
thumbnail sketch.
yes. So he's very clear that he's writing about their flaws and their weaknesses. What other observations? Yes, Anne.
These are very specific. They're not like general words of advice. They seem very targeted to something specific going on in these churches.
Yes, exactly, precisely. Yes.
These remind me very much of the letters of Paul.
How so? Speak to that.
Well, Paul wrote to admonish churches in his orbit of what they were doing, what they weren't doing. Those seem more specific than these. Well, of course, they're more meaningful to me because they're more in my language and more in my area of understanding. These are, well, they're apocalyptic.
Yes.
He's writing to see things that we wouldn't see in these churches.
Perfect. Yes, good. Any other thoughts? Yes, Dan.
there's a whole lot in here that I don't understand.
Amen, brother.
Like it's like hearing one end of a telephone call, right? Like,
Yeah.
There's a whole backstory here, or multiple backstories that I have no clue what this refers to, but he does.
Right. Yeah. Who are the Nicolaitans?
Yeah. Who are those
Who are
guys?
these guys?
Yeah.
We don't know.
Right. And
But we sure hate their works.
Yeah,
Right?
and,
Those Nicolaitans
how
doing
did
their
they-
Nicolaitan things.
How did they depart from their first love?
Yeah.
The people in Ephesus, like what's that about?
Yes, that's right. And that's the telephone call is a apt analogy. Often when we study letters, whether it's Paul's letters or these letters, we have to engage in a process that's called mirror reading. And what we mean by that is the only way of making sense of the context is just as though someone was like on their phone. Have you ever done this? Like, we've all done this, right? Admit it. Like, you're sitting there and someone's having a conversation and they're going on with the phone and you're like, oh my gosh, they're having a fight. I wonder, like, did he forget to pick up groceries on the way home? Is that what's happening? And you're trying to wonder, like, what's going on because you can only hear part of it, but you know, like, the other person is ticked off. They are so angry, right? But we don't know exactly what, but you can get part of it. That's exactly what we're doing with these letters is we're getting someone's mail, but we don't know what the other person, right, has said to them. Any other thoughts? Yes?
Well, I mean, when I picked it up and it was read, I mean, these are not his words. These are actually God's words, not him writing himself to these people.
Ah, yes. So you have a red letter Bible, right? Yeah. Or a red letter app, as the case may be. Yes. So, yes, these are the words of Jesus, right? These are the words that, if we went back to Revelation 1, right, it's right to the 7 churches. And then, so John is writing in the words of Jesus. Okay, so some observations about these letters that we've made. So John is writing to 7 churches. That seems significant, right? 7 we've talked about before. John is going to use lots of numbers. Numbers are really important to him. Numbers were important to people in the ancient world. They were symbolic. And so what would 7 churches signify? Yes, perfection, wholeness. And so there's a sense in which we can read this as though John is writing to the whole church, to the total church, to the complete church. And I think that makes sense. But also, John is writing to 7 churches in Asia. So he's writing to 7 churches, but also 7 specific churches. I think Anna was the one who brought this up, right? 7 specific churches, specific places, and different locales. So that's also important to keep in mind. And also, John is writing to 7 churches in Asia that know him, right? So this is not, they're not like, if I just randomly wrote to some other churches, or if Neil was going to write to some random church in, other states, well, they like, who's this guy? Why are you writing to us, right? Of course, they all know Neil. But if I try to do that, like, no one's going to know who I am, right? So, but we can expect that the people there know John. So what does that mean? Putting all this together. Well, there is a sense in which by writing to 7 churches, John probably means I'm writing to everybody, right? I'm writing to the whole church. That is kind of implicit. But we can't lose sight of the fact that he's actually writing to 7 specific places with specific histories and their own issues. And the important part to remember here is that when he's writing to these 7 churches, the letters don't end in chapter 3. I mean, they end, but all the rest of Revelation, that message, those visions, are meant to go to these 7 churches. They are a message to these 7 places. And it is easy, I think, for us to then assume that, well, this all is just for us, right? And this is where you get the Left Behind and the late great planet Earth, and that really all this imagery is just meant for me to decode about what's going on right now. But if I started telling you about the Astorians and their battle with the Blippians in the year 3140, do you care about that? Do you even know what that means? No. We don't care about the Blippians and the Astorians. We don't even know who they are. But that's exactly how it would have sounded to John's hearers if he was writing about the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese. They don't know who these people are. It would mean nothing to them. And so whatever John is writing must mean something specific to his audience. It has to have some language or some purchase on their own understanding. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a meaning beyond that, but it at least has to have a meaning to them, to be meaningful. In the same way that if we got some message about, the future in 2,000 or 3,000 years, that why would we care about that? I mean, it would be interesting maybe to like, oh, there's a society of the historians. That's exciting. But then we would go back to drinking our latte and not caring. So John's writing 7 letters to 7 churches. It seems significant that he's writing to the whole church, but he's also writing to these specific places, and he knows them. He knows their history. Okay, another thing that we kind of picked up on is that there is a pattern to these letters. We read 2 of them, and we could read all 7, but we would see the same pattern emerge. To the angel of the church of whatever city. This is how he starts. From, and then there's a description of Jesus. And notice the descriptions of Jesus, almost all of them refer back to the image that John had in Revelation 1. So when Aaron was talking about the crazy image of Jesus, like all the detail that was there, each of these pieces of imagery are now being applied to Jesus, to these churches, right? So to the angel of the church of whichever church this is, from this description of Jesus, I know your works, Jesus says, the red letter, as was pointed out, this is Jesus speaking, I know your works. And there's usually some kind of commendation. I know your works, I know that you're suffering, and these are the good things about it. But this I have against you, as was pointed out, that there's a critique as well. These are the things I have against you, and these are what you need to do. There's some kind of instruction. Let anyone who has ears listen to the Spirit. That gets repeated. And then finally, to the one who conquers, to the one who overcomes, and then there's some kind of promise that's given. This is the pattern for all 7 of these. So it's stylistic. It's something that we can look at in general. So he's writing this stylistic way to all of these 7 churches. Okay, so how do we make sense of these? How do we make sense of the 7 letters to the churches? Well, there's lots of things that we can do. Lots of different things actually that have been done with this as well. So how do we interpret these? Well, again, throughout Christian history, there's been lots of different ways of making sense of these 7 letters. And some are to see these as a symbolic representation of history. In other words, remember that chart we just saw, like the really crazy one with all the writing that went from like eternity to eternity? Well, some people have read these letters and they've thought, well, these 7 letters are a decoding of history. It's like future history. And so like the church in Ephesus was like this period of history, and then the next church is this one, and then Laodicea is this last one. I go way over here. That's how some people have read the letters of the 7 churches. But then again, if that's the framework that we're using to read these letters, notice what happens. That means that if that's really what John is trying to do, most of the rest of that doesn't apply to the churches he's actually writing to. Right? He's giving them future history, but only a tiny fraction actually applies to what they're going through and to what they're doing. Another way of understanding this is it's a symbolic representation of the whole church. In other words, these are issues that the whole church is dealing with and are dealing with, and the whole church can benefit from. So the advantage of this way of understanding these letters is that it does allow us to use these images and these symbols to apply to the whole church, and that seems to be in line a little bit with what John is doing, where he's writing to 7 churches symbolically. But lastly, we should keep in mind that he's writing to 7 specific churches in Asia. So I think that of these 3 ways of reading the letters, the first one seems the hardest to really make sense of. It seems like this is the last thing that John wants to do, is to give this very detailed explanation of all of history. That interests us, and the reason it interests us is because we are at the end of this history. Or at least that's how we often like to think of ourselves. But that would have meant very little to the people he's actually writing to. The second way of reading the letters, that it's representative of the whole church, I think is helpful. It's a way of commending that, hey, in the same way that the Corinthians had these problems that Paul writes to, or the same way that the Thessalonians had these problems, we can by analogy say, well, we have these problems because we're humans in a church as well. But the most immediate way is to understand these are 7 specific issues that John is writing to in these certain churches.
Question.
Yes?
Isn't this symbolic of the way the scripture's written, that you can read several layers in it? It can be symbolic of the church's issue. It can be symbolic of the personal issues. You know, I know what you're saying there. But I mean, if you read the
Yeah, well, I think let's think about the readings. For those of us who went to the 9 o'clock service, we had a reading from the book of Amos. It was Amos, right? That was our reading this morning. Amos writes in a specific time and place to a certain people at about a specific issue, right? And so understanding what Amos is saying is in part understanding what was going on at this time in Israel. And you can do a lot of that work historically to understand how the people from Israel, from the northern kingdom, would understand that. What Amos, he's a sycamore farmer. Is that what it is? He does stuff with trees. He's not a prophet. Like, all of that makes sense of his situation. We can understand the language of Amos. That does not mean that the message of Amos has nothing to say to us. But in order to understand that, we have to understand its message that it had at that time, and then do the work to apply it to us. And we're doing the same thing, I think, when we look at the letters to the 7 churches in Asia. Does that make sense? So it's not that because it's written to these 7 churches, therefore it really has nothing to do with us and we can all just pack up and go home. That's not what we want to conclude. But the work that we have to do to make it meaningful for us is to first understand, how did this make sense to them? And then by analogy, by this work, how can that apply to us as well? So we're going to do that, actually. This is a great segue to this next part of it. Okay, so what are the problems that are addressed in these 7 churches? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to look at these through three large lenses, 3 general ways of grouping these churches together. If we had more time, we could look at each of these in great detail and go through them all, but we're going to look at just 3 families of problems that seem to be addressed. All right, the first problem is the problem of assimilation. In the letter to Ephesus, which is the one that we read, we have the teaching of the Nicolaitans that he hates. He hates their teaching. What is it? We don't know. We don't know what it is, but he knows we don't like it. We don't like it. We don't approve of them and what they're doing. But notice it says, I hate their teaching. I don't hate them. That's an important distinction. Jesus does not hate the Nicolaitans, but he does not like what they're saying. There are problems with those who are claiming to be apostles, but they are not. Right? So there's these problems of belief, of structure. If we read the letter to the church at Pergamum, he talks about tolerating Balaam. And I've put that in quotation marks. Anyone remember who Balaam is? Anybody? This is an Old Testament guy. Balaam? Yes. I'm glad that the priest can say that. Yes. Balaam was a character from the book of Numbers, and he prophesies first against Israel and then for Israel, and he becomes an opponent to Israel in a sense. So symbolically, and here we are again, he's using the name Balaam to talk about probably a real person who was doing or saying something in this church that seemed contradictory or contrary to what John thought was appropriate. And this Balaam, what's he doing? He's advocating the eating of food sacrificed to idols and fornication. And I've also put this, fornication, this is this like old word that we don't really use this anymore. I can't remember the last time I heard the word fornication or fornicate outside of a church context. Like, it's not really a word we use a whole lot. This is actually translating this Greek word porneia, which just means unlawful sexual activity. So the question is he really concerned about people sleeping together? Well, maybe. That can be a legitimate concern. But in the Old Testament, this language of fornication or adultery was also a symbolic way of talking about idolatry. When Israel went astray, when they worshipped other gods, they would commit adultery with Yahweh. They would fornicate against Yahweh. They would create relationships with other gods in an intimate way. And so this was the language of idolatry. And probably what John means here is not simply unlawful sexual activity, although that could be in view, but probably what he means by fornication is this sense of idolatry, not worshiping God properly. And then likewise in Thyatira, if we read that letter in detail, we would see that he says, you tolerate a Jezebel. Anyone remember Jezebel, where she was from? Anyone want to explain Jezebel's story real quick? Who was Jezebel? Anyone remember?
The wife of the king of Judah, and she connived to get a vineyard that he tried to buy, and he couldn't buy it, so she got rid of the owner so he could get the vineyard, and she was an idolater. She worshipped in idolatrous ways.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Ahab's wife. Ahab is a king, and he marries Jezebel, who is not an Israelite, and she brings with her the worship of Baal. She She brings the worship of Baal into Israel. And remember the Elijah story? Elijah makes a big deal about, who you're going to worship, the true God or Baal, and they have the whole showdown. That's Jezebel. So she, again, probably there's no woman actually named Jezebel that John is writing to, but she is representative of this figure who leads Israel astray. And so is leading this church astray. Because why? Because she's teaching that people should eat food sacrificed to idols and fornication. It's the same thing, the same kinds of issues. Okay, so part of the problem, if we look at all this together, is the problem of assimilation. That one of the things that John is addressing is that to be faithful as Christians in a church means that you don't completely assimilate to the culture around you. You can't just do the same things that everybody else does. That's not what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus. And so some of the problems addressed are the problems of assimilating. And again, these are the same kinds of issues that we would deal with, right? I mean, what makes us different as Christians? What makes us different about being communities of this church different from everybody else in the world? Neil talked this morning about how we're a hair's breadth away from nihilism, but that hair's breadth is important. It matters. It matters a great deal, right? That we have that hair's breadth. Okay, other issues, other families of things that are being addressed. Persecution. So this is another kind of family of problems that are being addressed in these letters. So the Church of Smyrna, which we read, there's the problem of the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not. Right? This is strong language. It's important to remember here that everybody's a Jew. This is an inter-Jewish dialogue, right? So this is not someone on the outside making fun of the Jews or talking about Jews or John is a Jew. People he's writing to are likely Jewish, many of them, and the opponents are Jews. So this would be like Episcopalians criticizing Episcopalians, which would not be the first time apparently that has happened. So, right, so it's an inter-family dispute. But they're suffering from persecution, and most likely the persecution that they are suffering from is not systemic Roman persecution. That's going to happen. That comes later in history, where the Romans come and they go to the churches and they take your Bibles and they kill you and they burn your churches down. That does happen, but not yet. Probably yes, question.
Yes, I'm confused.
Confused?
Yeah. So these churches are Jewish, right? Are they considered Christian also?
This is a great question. So part of the problem is the language that has developed now. So when we say Christian and Jew now, these are separate things. These are separate categories. To be a Christian now and to be a Jew are two separate things, almost certainly. There's a very small sliver of people that are in overlap, and we want to acknowledge that. But for the most part, when we use those terms today, they're different things. It's like talking about being a Buddhist and talking about being a Hindu. They're not the same thing, right? At this point in time, there's a lot of overlap. Jesus was a Jew. All the disciples were Jews. Everybody in the story were Jews. The guy in the gospel reading who came over who was rich, he was probably Jewish. Like, all the people are Jewish. And only later do non-Jews start becoming Christians. And eventually what happens over time in history is that the number of people who are Jewish and Christian goes down, and the number of people who are not Jewish and Christian goes up, until you're left with a non-Jewish Christian movement and a Jewish non-Christian movement. And that's history. That's not what we have here. What we have here is that he was writing to. John is a Jew and a Christian, and he's writing to people who are Jews and Christians, and he's probably talking about Jews who are Christians as well. Though this language of they say they are Jews that are not, they're not faithful, they're not true in the truest sense of the word. So that's part of the confusion. Is the language that we use today is very different, and so when we say Jew, we mean someone who's not Christian. That's not the case in the first century. That becomes very confusing. So that makes a lot of sense. Same thing with Philadelphia, the other church. Those of the synagogue of Satan, they say they are Jews and they are not. They're suffering persecution, likely the persecution of just not getting along with people, right? That we have these neighbors, and they're Christians, and they're kind of weird, and they don't come and eat the food sacrificed to our idols, and they don't participate in society. We invited them over for skee ball, and they didn't come for skee ball. They're just kind of, right, and so we don't really hang out with them. We don't talk about them. This is the kind of persecution likely that they're encountering. This is kind of very local, we don't like them kind of persecution. All right, last problem, the problem of complacency. And these two churches that John writes to, Sardis and Laodicea. In Sardis, he says, you have a name for being alive, but you are dead. Wake up, Jesus says. You have a name for being alive, but you are in fact dead. The appearance and the reality are different. And the Laodiceans, he says, you say, I am rich, I have prospered, I need nothing. But the reality, Jesus says, is that you are pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. Right? You don't embrace your calling as my disciples fully and completely. There's a reality that you claim, or there's something on the surface that you claim, and there's a reality underneath. And so these three families of problems are the things that John is addressing to these churches. The problem of assimilation, where are the lines between what it means to be part of the church and part of the world? The problem of persecution, the world persecuting you, leaving you out. And the problem of complacency, the problem inside the church of living out your calling fully. These problems are the kinds of lenses we can use to read the rest of Revelation. This is our entry into the rest of the book. And so it's easy to kind of read these letters and think, okay, that's great. And then we get to the weird stuff. And then we kind of we don't want to forget about this. This is the lens that all that weird stuff is going to make sense of. It's how we understand the imagery of beasts and prophets and monsters, and all the rest of that is through these lenses of what John is writing to these churches. So he's writing to these 7 churches, and all the rest of the imagery that we're going to talk about and the rest of our time is through these lenses of what these churches need. The problems of persecution, of assimilation, and of complacency. I did want to leave a few minutes for some questions before we get out of here. Any questions about what we talked about before we jump to next week's discussion? So I know that was a lot to go through. The purpose of this, yes?
Just a question, and maybe I'm just taking issue with you. You said the way we think of Jews as anyone who is not Christian. I think of Jews, and was brought up to believe that Jews are ethnically different as well as religious, in their religious practice. Was that the wrong interpretation?
No, it's not the wrong interpretation. So now, to be a Jew and to be a Christian are two different things. Is that what you mean?
Well,
That they're different ethnically and religiously?
To be a Jew is much more complex.
It is. It is more complex. When we use the language as Christians.
It's complex to be a Christian, I'm not saying.
That's right, yeah. So being a Jew now has an ethnic component to it as well as a religious component. But when we talk about these spheres, we would never talk, well, I shouldn't say never, we would rarely talk about someone who is Jewish. If we said, for example, oh, this person is Jewish, the implication of that is that they're not Christian. Now, there is a small exception to this. There is a group of Messianic Jews. But for the most part, and for most of history after the 1st or 2nd century, to be Jewish and to be Christian were different things. That's the point to be made, is that they were different categories, and they polemicized against each other. In fact, in most synagogues, a lot of Jewish movements would say, you can come to our synagogue and you can be Hindu and be Jewish.
But you can't be a woman. You can't go into a synagogue as a female. That's been my experience. Not in America, but in the Middle East.
I think yes. So it depends on what kind of Jewish movement you're talking about. You can't be. You can be Hindu. You can be Buddhist and be a Jew. But the one thing most Jewish movements would say is that you cannot be a Christian and be a Jew, and that's because of the long history of Jewish and Christian relations that have been very acrimonious, and that comes to a head in World War II with the Holocaust. And after that, it caused a great deal of self-reflection among a lot of Christians who said, what got us to the point where we were willing to basically turn a blind eye to the persecution of these people? And so there's been a lot of good dialogue since the 40s on that, but we have a long way to go. But for the most part, when we use those terms today, we mean two separate religious groups. It involves a sense of ethnicity and history as well on the Jewish side, but the point is that they're separate spheres. In the 1st century, it's more complicated than that, because everybody who's being talked about is, like when we read the Gospel of Mark, almost everybody in that story is Jewish. Any other questions before we go? I know that we're got to get to service. Questions? Okay, we are going to come back next week, and we're going to look at Revelation 4 and 5. This is where all the visions and the weird stuff happens, so I will see you back here next week. Thanks so much.